After my husband died of cancer, my daughter sold my $6 million house without telling me. The next day she handed me a check for $1,000 and said, "Pay for a cheap hotel and disappear from here." I just smiled. She had no idea what I had prepared. Subscribe to the channel for more stories like this and comment the city you're watching from. I never imagined that losing my husband would be just the beginning of my pain. Robert had been gone for exactly 3 months when I discovered what Claire had done. 3 months of grieving, of trying to put the pieces of my life back together, of believing that at least I had my daughter's support during the darkest period of my existence. I was 60 years old, and for the first time in my adult life, I was completely alone. Robert and I had been married for 35 years. We'd built our life together from nothing, working side by side until we could afford that beautiful house overlooking the lake. $6 million it was worth, but to me, it was priceless. Every room held memories of Robert, of the life we'd shared. The morning everything changed started like any other. I was sitting in my kitchen, the same spot where Robert used to read me the newspaper headlines while I made coffee. The silence in that house had become deafening since his death. That's when I heard Claire's key in the front door. "Mom, we need to talk," she said, walking in without her usual fake smile. Something in her tone made my stomach tighten. Claire was 32, always perfectly dressed, always calculating. Even as a child, she'd been different from other kids. More focused on what she could get than what she could give. She sat across from me at the kitchen table, the same table where Robert had told me about his cancer diagnosis 18 months earlier. Her manicured nails drummed against the wood surface, a sound that reminded me of rain against the windows during those long nights at the hospital. "I've sold the house," she said, just like that. No emotion, no explanation. As if she was telling me she'd bought groceries. My coffee cup froze halfway to my lips. "What did you say?" "The house. I sold it. The papers were signed yesterday." She reached into her oversized purse and pulled out a check. "Here's your share." I stared at the piece of paper she'd placed in front of me. $1,000. Written out in her perfect handwriting, "Pay to the order of Joan Mitchell. 1,000 and no cents." "Claire, I don't understand." My voice sounded strange, distant. "This is my house. Robert left it to both of us." She shrugged, the gesture so casual it felt like a slap. "Actually, Mom, if you'd bothered to read the will properly, you'd know that I was designated as the executor. That gives me the authority to make decisions about the estate. But this is where I live. This is my home." "Not anymore." She stood up, smoothing down her designer dress. "Look, Mom, I know this seems harsh, but you need to face reality. You can't afford to maintain this place. The property taxes alone are $25,000 a year. The insurance, the maintenance, the utilities. You'd burn through whatever savings Dad left you in no time." Every word felt carefully rehearsed, as if she'd practiced this speech in front of a mirror. I knew my daughter well enough to recognize when she was lying, and everything about her body language screamed deception. "Where am I supposed to live?" The question came out as barely a whisper. Claire's expression didn't soften even slightly. "I don't know, Mom. Find some cheap hotel or something. There are plenty of options for people in your situation." She paused at the door, her hand already on the handle. "The new owners are moving in tomorrow morning. You need to be gone by tonight." And then she was walking away, her high heels clicking against the hardwood floors that Robert and I had refinished together 10 years ago. I heard her car start in the driveway, heard her drive away without a backward glance. I sat there in my empty kitchen, staring at that check for $1,000, and something strange happened. Instead of breaking down, instead of crying, or screaming or falling apart, I started to smile, because Claire didn't know what Robert had told me during those last weeks in the hospital. She didn't know about the conversations we'd had when the morphine made him lucid in the middle of the night. She didn't know about the envelope he'd hidden in his desk drawer, the one with my name written on it in his shaking handwriting. Most importantly, she didn't know that Robert had seen this coming from the moment his cancer returned. My husband had been many things, but naive wasn't one of them. He'd watched Claire's behavior during his illness, noticed how she'd started asking questions about assets, about the will, about what would happen to everything when he was gone. "Joni," he'd whispered to me one night when the pain was particularly bad, "if something happens to Claire after I'm gone, if she tries to take advantage of you, remember the blue folder in my desk. Everything you need is in there." At the time, I'd thought he was just being paranoid, maybe confused from the medication. But now, sitting in my kitchen with that insulting check in front of me, I understood. Robert had known our daughter better than I'd wanted to admit. I walked to his study, the room that still smelled like his cologne and old books. His desk was exactly as he'd left it, and there, in the bottom drawer behind his collection of fountain pens, was the blue folder. Inside were documents I'd never seen before. Legal papers, correspondence with attorneys I'd never heard of, bank statements for accounts that weren't in our joint names. And on top of everything, a letter addressed to me. My hands shook as I opened it. Robert's handwriting was weak but legible. "Joan, if you're reading this, then Claire has shown her true colors. I'm sorry I won't be there to protect you, but I've made sure you won't be defenseless. The house was never in both your names the way she thinks. I moved it into a trust 6 months ago, with you as the sole beneficiary. Claire has no legal authority to sell what doesn't belong to her." The papers scattered across his desk as I grabbed the edge to steady myself. Everything Claire had just done, every cruel word she'd spoken, every assumption she'd made about my helplessness, it was all based on a lie, but there was more. Much more. And as I read through the documents Robert had left for me, I realized that my husband hadn't just protected me from Claire's greed. He'd set a trap that was about to close. Around our daughter's perfectly manicured fingers, I picked up my phone and dialed the number written at the bottom of Robert's letter. A law office I'd never heard of, but apparently, they'd been waiting for my call. The law office of Henderson and Associates was nothing like the flashy downtown firms where Claire worked as a paralegal. It was tucked into a quiet residential area, the kind of place where serious work got done without fanfare. As I sat in the waiting room the next morning, I couldn't stop thinking about how different this moment could have been. I remembered when Claire graduated from community college. Robert and I had been so proud, even though she'd taken 6 years to finish a 2-year degree. We'd thrown her a party, invited all the relatives, made such a fuss. She'd seemed genuinely happy that day, hugging us both, talking about her future plans. When had it all gone wrong? When had my little girl become someone who could look me in the eye and throw me out of my own home? "Mrs. Mitchell?" A tall man with graying hair and kind eyes appeared in the doorway. "I'm David Henderson. I'm so sorry for your loss." His office was warm and comfortable, with family photos on the desk and law books lining the walls. Not the sterile corporate environment I'd expected. "Your husband was a remarkable man," Mr. Henderson said as I settled into the chair across from his desk. "He came to me about 8 months ago, very concerned about protecting you from what he saw as inevitable financial manipulation." I clutched my purse tighter. He never told me he was worried about Claire. Robert didn't want to upset you while you were dealing with his illness. But he'd noticed things. The way Claire had started asking pointed questions about your assets. How she'd volunteered to handle more and more of your finances. The fact that she'd asked him multiple times about being named executor of his will. My throat felt tight. I thought she was just trying to help. Maybe she started that way. But Robert was concerned enough to take legal action. He pulled out a thick folder. 6 months before his death, your husband transferred the house into something called the Mitchell Family Trust. You are the sole trustee and beneficiary. Claire has no legal claim to the property whatsoever. The relief was overwhelming, but it was quickly followed by a terrible realization. If that's true, then what she did yesterday was completely illegal. She sold property that didn't belong to her. That's fraud, Mrs. Mitchell. Serious fraud. I thought about Claire clicking across my floors in her expensive shoes, so confident, so sure of herself. She had no idea what she'd just walked into. "There's more," Mr. Henderson continued. "Your husband suspected this might happen, so he prepared additional protections. The buyers of your house, they were contacted by our office this morning. They've been informed that the sale was illegal and that they need to immediately stop all proceedings." "What about the money? The $6 million? Still sitting in an escrow account. Claire can't touch a penny of it without proper legal authorization, which she'll never get because she had no right to sell the house in the first place." I leaned back in my chair, feeling dizzy. "So where does that leave her?" Mr. Henderson's expression grew serious. "In a great deal of trouble, I'm afraid. She's already spent some of the money she thought she was getting. Our investigators have been tracking her purchases since yesterday. A new car, an expensive handbag, dinner at some very upscale restaurants. She's been celebrating. The image of Claire spending money that wasn't hers while I sat in that empty house with a check for $1,000 made my chest burn with anger. But there was something else, something that felt almost like sadness. This was my daughter we were talking about. The baby I'd rocked to sleep, the child I'd bandaged when she fell off her bicycle. "What happens now?" I asked. "That depends on what you want to happen, Mrs. Mitchell. We can have her arrested for fraud. We can sue her for damages and legal fees. We can make sure this follows her for the rest of her life." He paused, studying my face. "Or we can handle this more quietly, as a family matter." I thought about Robert, about those long nights at the hospital when he'd hold my hand and worry about what would happen to me. He protected me even when I didn't know I needed protection. But what would he want me to do about Claire? "I need some time to think," I said finally. "Of course. But Mrs. Mitchell, there is one thing you should know. Your daughter called our office this morning. She wanted to know if there were any irregularities with the sale. She seemed nervous. A smile tugged at the corners of my mouth. Did she now? She did. And she's not the only one who's been calling. The real estate agent has been trying to reach you. Apparently, there are some questions about the title transfer that she can't answer. As I drove home from the lawyer's office, I found myself thinking about the last real conversation I'd had with Claire. It was 3 weeks before Robert died, and she'd come to visit him in the hospital. I'd stepped out to get coffee, and when I came back, I could hear them talking through the partially open door. Dad, I'm really worried about Mom, Claire had been saying. She's not good with money, you know that. And this house is going to be way too much for her to handle on her own. Robert's voice had been weak but firm. Your mother is stronger than you think, Claire. And smarter. But Dad, be realistic. She's going to need help making decisions. Big decisions. Maybe it would be better if I had some legal authority to know. Robert's voice had gotten stronger then, more like the man I'd married. Your mother doesn't need anyone making decisions for her. I'd stood in that hospital hallway, holding 2 cups of terrible coffee, and listened to my daughter try to manipulate my dying husband. At the time, I'd told myself she meant well, that she was just worried. But now I understood what Robert had heard in her voice that day. When I got back to the house, my house, I found 3 messages on the answering machine. All from Claire. Mom, call me back. There might be some paperwork issues with the sale. Mom, where are you? The real estate agent is asking questions I can't answer. Mom, call me right now. Something's wrong. I erased all 3 messages without calling her back. Instead, I made myself a cup of tea and sat in Robert's study, looking through the rest of the documents he'd left me. There were bank statements, insurance policies, investment accounts, so many things I'd never paid attention to because I'd trusted him to handle our finances. But as I read through everything, I began to understand that Robert had been preparing for this possibility for longer than 8 months. Some of these documents were dated from over a year ago. He'd been watching Claire, documenting her behavior, protecting me from something he'd seen coming long before his cancer returned. The phone rang again. Claire, of course, this time, I answered. Mom, thank God. Where have you been? I've been trying to reach you all day. Her voice was different now. Not the cold, dismissive tone from yesterday. Now she sounded worried, maybe even scared. I've been busy, I said calmly. Look, there's been some kind of mix-up with the house sale. The buyers are saying there are problems with the title. Something about a trust? Do you know anything about that? I took a sip of my tea, savoring the moment. Oh yes, dear. I know quite a bit about that. The silence on the other end of the line stretched for several long seconds. When Claire finally spoke again, her voice was barely above a whisper. What do you mean? The silence on the phone stretched until I could almost hear Claire's heart racing. I'd never heard my daughter sound uncertain before, and I found myself savoring every second of her discomfort. What I mean, Claire, is that your father was much more careful about our assets than you realized. I kept my voice steady, almost conversational. He moved the house into a trust 6 months before he died. The Mitchell Family Trust, to be exact. I could hear her sharp intake of breath. That's impossible. I would have known about that. Would you? You never asked your father about his legal arrangements. You just assumed that being named executor gave you control over everything. I walked to the kitchen window, looking out at the lake that had been my view for 20 years. It doesn't work that way, dear. Mom, what are you talking about? I have the will right here. It clearly states that the house goes to both of us, with me as executor. That will is from 2 years ago, Claire. Your father updated his estate planning several times after his diagnosis. But he didn't feel the need to discuss every detail with you. The lie came so easily. Robert had tried to discuss it with her, had wanted to include her in the planning. But every conversation had turned into Claire pushing for more control, more authority over decisions that weren't hers to make. This is ridiculous, Claire said, but her voice cracked slightly. Even if there is some trust, that doesn't change anything. I'm still the executor. Actually, it changes everything. You can't sell property that belongs to a trust when you're not the trustee. That's called fraud, Claire. The kind that comes with serious legal consequences. I heard what sounded like papers shuffling, then Claire's voice, sharper now with panic. Who did you talk to? What lawyer? The same firm your father used for the trust documents. Henderson and Associates. They've been very helpful in explaining exactly what you've done. There was a long pause, and when Claire spoke again, her tone had shifted completely. Gone was the confident woman who had thrown me out of my own home. In her place was someone who was beginning to understand just how badly she'd miscalculated. Mom, look, maybe we got off on the wrong foot yesterday. I was just trying to protect you from having to deal with all the legal complications of maintaining the house. Maybe we can work something out. Work something out? I almost laughed. Yesterday you told me to find a cheap hotel and disappear. Today you want to work something out? I was upset yesterday. Emotional. You know how hard Dad's death has been. On all of us. The audacity was breathtaking. She was trying to rewrite history, to make herself the victim of circumstances rather than the architect of them. Where are you right now, Claire? I'm at work. Why? I think you should go home. Check your mail. There might be some legal documents waiting for you. Another silence, longer this time. What kind of legal documents? The kind that people receive when they've committed real estate fraud. The buyers of our house have been notified that the sale was illegal. Their lawyers are not happy. Neither are ours. I could hear Claire's breathing getting faster. Mom, this is crazy. We can fix this. We can figure out some arrangement that works for everyone. Can we? Because yesterday you seemed very clear about what you wanted. You wanted me gone so you could have everything for yourself. That's not what I meant. I was just thinking about the practical aspects of the situation. No, Claire. You were thinking about $6 million that you believed belonged to you. The admission hung in the air between us like a live wire. I'd finally said what we both knew was true. This had never been about protecting me or making practical decisions about the house. This had been about Claire's greed, plain and simple. I need to see these trust documents, she said finally. I need to understand what Dad actually did. I'm sure you do. But that's not really my problem anymore, is it? Mom, please. I know I handled things badly yesterday, but we're still family. We can work this out together. Family. The word felt hollow coming from her lips after what she'd put me through. But there was something else in her voice now, something I'd never heard before from my confident, calculating daughter. Fear. I'm going to hang up now, Claire. I have some phone calls to make. Wait, Mom, don't hang up. We need to talk about this. We did talk about this yesterday. You made your position very clear then. I disconnected the call and immediately turned off the ringer. Within minutes, the light on the answering machine was blinking as Claire called back, again and again. I spent the rest of the afternoon going through more of Robert's papers, discovering just how thorough he'd been in protecting me. There were copies of every conversation he'd had with the lawyers, detailed notes about Claire's behavior during his illness, even recordings of some of their phone calls where she'd pressed him about the will and inheritance. My husband had been building a case, documenting everything, preparing for exactly what had happened yesterday. It wasn't paranoia, it was love. He'd known he couldn't protect me himself, so he'd made sure the law would do it for him. The phone rang again around 6 o'clock. This time it wasn't Claire, it was Mr. Henderson. Mrs. Mitchell, I wanted to update you on the situation. Your daughter retained a lawyer this afternoon. Marcus Webb from Webb & Associates. He's been asking questions about the trust documents. What kind of questions? The kind that suggest your daughter is looking for loopholes. Ways to challenge the validity of the trust or claim that she was somehow deceived about her father's intentions. I felt a familiar tightness in my chest. Even now, even facing the consequences of what she'd done, Claire was still looking for ways to take what wasn't hers. Can she do that? Challenge the trust? She can try. But your husband was very careful about how he structured everything. The trust was created properly, with multiple witnesses, clear documentation of his mental capacity, and specific language about his intentions. Any challenge she makes will be expensive and almost certainly unsuccessful. Almost certainly? Mrs. Mitchell, in-law, nothing is ever 100% guaranteed. But I can tell you that your husband's estate planning was some of the most thorough I've ever seen. He anticipated every possible challenge Claire might make and took steps to prevent them. After I hung up with Mr. Henderson, I walked through the house slowly, room by room. This morning I'd thought I was about to lose everything. Now I understood that not only was my home safe, but Claire had walked into a legal trap that would have consequences far beyond what she'd imagined. In Robert's study, I found something I'd missed earlier, a sealed envelope with, "For Joan," open after the first call, written on it in his careful handwriting. Inside was another letter, shorter than the first but somehow more painful to read. My dearest Joan, if you're reading this, then Claire has shown you exactly who she is, and you've begun to understand what I've prepared. I know this is hard, she's our daughter, and part of you will always want to protect her from the consequences of her choices. But sometimes the most loving thing you can do is let someone face the results of their actions. Claire needs to learn that her behavior has costs, real costs, or she'll never change. I've given you the tools to teach her that lesson. Use them wisely. All my love, Robert. I folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the envelope. Outside, the sun was setting over the lake, painting the water in shades of gold and pink. That Robert had always loved. Tomorrow, Claire would begin to understand just how expensive her betrayal was going to be, but tonight, for the first time since Robert's death, I felt like I wasn't facing the world alone. 3 days passed before I heard from Claire again. 3 blissful days of silence while I began to piece my life back together, and she, presumably, began to understand the magnitude of what she'd done. I spent those days reading through every document Robert had left me, learning about assets I'd never known we had, understanding the careful web of protection he'd woven around our life together. It was like getting to know a part of my husband I'd never seen before, the strategist, the protector, the man who'd loved me enough to wage war with our own daughter to keep me safe. On Thursday morning, I was having coffee in the kitchen when I saw Claire's car pull into the driveway. She sat there for several minutes before getting out, and when she finally walked to the front door, everything about her posture had changed. Gone was the confident stride, the entitled bearing. She looked smaller somehow, uncertain. I let her knock twice before I answered. "Hello, Claire." She looked terrible. Her usually perfect makeup was slightly smudged, her hair not quite as styled as normal. The expensive clothes were the same, but they seemed to hang differently on her frame. "Mom, we need to talk." "Do we? I thought we covered everything on Monday." "Please. Can I come in?" I stepped aside and let her enter. She walked to the living room and stood awkwardly near the couch, as if she wasn't sure she was welcome to sit down. "I've been meeting with lawyers," she said without preamble. "About the trust situation." "And what have they told you?" Claire's hands were shaking slightly as she reached into her purse and pulled out a thick stack of papers. "They've told me that Dad apparently created a complex legal structure designed to cut me out of any inheritance." "That's one way to look at it," I said calmly. "Another way would be to say that your father protected his assets from someone he knew would try to steal them." She flinched at the word steal, but pressed on. "Mom, this isn't just about the house anymore. Do you understand what you've done by involving lawyers? The buyers are threatening to sue me for damages. They've already put deposits down, started making plans. They want compensation for their losses." I settled into Robert's favorite armchair, feeling strangely calm. "How much compensation?" $200,000. Plus legal fees. Her voice cracked slightly. "Mom, I don't have that kind of money." "Don't you? You seemed very confident about your financial situation on Monday." "The money from the house sale, it's all tied up in escrow now. I can't touch any of it until this legal mess gets sorted out." I studied my daughter's face. The arrogance was gone, replaced by something that looked almost like desperation. But I'd learned not to trust Claire's expressions. She'd always been good at showing people what she thought they wanted to see. "What about the money you've already spent?" Her face went pale. "What do you mean?" "Claire, I'm not stupid. You celebrated after you threw me out. New car, shopping sprees, expensive dinners. How much did you spend thinking you were rich?" The silence stretched between us. Finally, she whispered, "About $15,000. I nodded slowly. $15,000 that you'll have to pay back, plus the $200,000 in damages, plus legal fees. That's quite a bill for someone who doesn't have access to the money they thought they were getting." "Mom, please." "I know I handled things wrong on Monday. I was grieving, I was stressed, I wasn't thinking clearly." "You were thinking very clearly, Claire. You had this all planned out before you even came over here." She started to protest, but I held up my hand. "I found your notebook, dear. In your father's study. The one where you'd calculated exactly how much the house was worth, how much the property taxes were, how much you thought it would cost to maintain. You'd done your research." Claire's face went from pale to ashen. She'd forgotten about that notebook, the one she'd left behind in her rush to get me out of the house. "You wrote down everything," I continued. "Including your plan to convince me that I couldn't afford to keep the house. Including your research into retirement communities where you thought I should live. Including your calculation of how little money you could give me and still look like you were being generous." "Mom, that wasn't." "I was just trying to be prepared for different scenarios." $1,000, Claire. Out of 6 million. That's what you calculated would be enough to get rid of me." She was crying now, but I wasn't sure if the tears were from guilt or frustration at being caught. "I was going to take care of you," she said through her tears. "I was going to make sure you had everything you needed. By putting me in a retirement home and controlling my money. By making sure you didn't have to worry about anything. By handling all the complicated financial stuff so you could just focus on grieving Dad and moving on with your life." The rationalization was so complete, so perfectly constructed, that for a moment I almost admired it. Claire had created an entire narrative where she was the responsible daughter protecting her helpless mother from the burden of wealth. And what about the other 15 years of mortgage payments I made on this house? I asked. What about the $150,000 I inherited from my mother that I put into renovations? Was that part of your plan to take care of me? Claire looked genuinely surprised. What are you talking about? Your father wasn't the only one who contributed to this house, Claire. I wasn't just some helpless widow he left behind. I worked. I saved, I invested in our life together. But you never bothered to find that out, did you? The truth was starting to dawn on her face. She'd assumed that everything had come from Robert, that I'd been nothing more than a dependent wife who'd contributed nothing to our assets. You didn't just try to steal your father's money, I said quietly. You tried to steal mine too. The crying stopped abruptly. For just a moment, I saw a flash of the real Claire, not the desperate woman pleading for help, but the cold calculator who'd thrown me out of my own home. What do you want from me? She asked, her voice flat. I want you to understand what you've done. I want you to face the consequences of your choices. And I want you to figure out how you're going to pay back the people you've hurt. I can't pay them back if I can't access the money from the house sale. Then I guess you have a problem. Claire stood up abruptly, pacing to the window. This is insane, Mom. We're destroying each other over money. Is this really what Dad would have wanted? Your father wanted to protect me from exactly what you tried to do. I'd say his plan is working perfectly. She turned back to me, and for the first time in the conversation, her expression looked genuinely desperate. What if I give you back the house completely? What if I sign papers saying I have no claim to any of it? You never had a claim to it, in the first place. But what if I make it official? What if I publicly acknowledge that I made a mistake? I considered this. It was tempting, not because I needed her acknowledgement, but because it would be satisfying to have her admit what she'd done. And what about the money you owe the buyers? The legal fees? The money you've already spent? Claire's shoulders sagged. I don't know. I'll have to figure something out. You'll have to get a job, you mean? A real job that pays enough to cover your debts. The look she gave me was pure horror. Claire had worked as a paralegal for years, but she'd always lived beyond her means, counting on eventually inheriting enough money to make up the difference. Mom, please. There has to be another way. I stood up slowly, feeling every one of my 60 years but also feeling stronger than I had in months. There is another way, Claire. You can learn to live within your means. You can take responsibility for your actions. You can become the kind of person your father hoped you would be. And if I do that? If I change? I looked at my daughter, this stranger who had my eyes and Robert's stubborn chin, and felt a deep sadness settle in my chest. Then maybe, someday, we can have the relationship we should have had all along. She left without another word, and I watched her drive away knowing that the real test was just beginning. 2 weeks passed, and I watched from a distance as Claire's world began to unravel with the precision of a Swiss watch. Mr. Henderson called me every few days with updates, his voice carrying a mixture of professional satisfaction and human sympathy. She's hired 3 different lawyers, he told me during one of our conversations. Each one has told her essentially the same thing: she has no legal grounds to challenge the trust, and she's facing serious financial liability for the fraudulent sale. I was sitting in Robert's study when he called, surrounded by photo albums I'd finally felt strong enough to look through. Pictures of Claire as a baby, as a toddler, as a young woman graduating from college. It was hard to reconcile those images with the person who had tried to steal my home. What's she doing about the money she owes? I asked. That's where it gets interesting. She's been trying to get loans, using her condo as collateral. But the amounts she needs are substantial, and her income as a paralegal won't support the kind of debt she's looking at. Through my kitchen window, I could see the lake where Robert and I used to walk every evening after dinner. Those walks seemed like a lifetime ago now, back when I believed my biggest worry was learning to live without him. She's also been calling your neighbors, Mr. Henderson continued. Apparently trying to find out if any of them would be willing to testify that your husband was mentally incapacitated when he created the trust. I wasn't surprised. It was exactly the kind of desperate move I'd come to expect from Claire. And what did they tell her? Mrs. Peterson next door was quite indignant. She told me that Claire suggested your husband was not in his right mind during his final months. Mrs. Peterson reminded her that Robert was sharp as a tack right up until the end, and that she found the suggestion insulting. A small smile tugged at my lips. Eleanor Peterson had been our neighbor for 15 years, and she'd visited Robert regularly during his illness. She'd seen firsthand how mentally alert he remained even as his body failed him. There's something else, Mr. Henderson said, and his tone grew more serious. Claire has been posting on social media about the situation. Nothing directly accusatory, but she's crafting a narrative about being cut out of her inheritance by a manipulative stepmother. My blood ran cold. Stepmother? Robert and I were married for 35 years. I'm her biological mother. I know that, Mrs. Mitchell. But that's not the story she's telling online. She's claiming that you married her father late in life and manipulated him into changing his will to benefit you at her expense. The cruelty of it took my breath away. Not only was Claire trying to steal my money and my home, but she was now trying to steal my very identity as her mother. She was rewriting our entire family history to make herself look like the victim. She's posted pictures of herself as a child with her father, but notably, none that include you, Mr. Henderson continued. She's telling people that her real mother died when she was young, and that you're essentially a gold digger who swooped in to steal her inheritance. I set down my coffee cup with shaking hands. The level of betrayal was beyond anything I had imagined possible. It was one thing to try to take my house, it was another thing entirely to try to erase me as a person, as a mother, as someone who had loved and raised her for 32 years. How many people believe her? Enough. She's gotten several hundred sympathetic comments, and someone has started a crowdfunding campaign to help her fight the injustice. It's raised about $3,000 so far. $3,000 from strangers who believed I was a villain in a story that bore no resemblance to reality. I wondered if any of them had bothered to question Claire's version of events, or if they'd simply been drawn to the drama of a young woman supposedly wronged by a scheming older woman. Mr. Henderson, is there anything we can do about these lies? We could pursue a defamation case, but that would require going public with the real facts of the situation. It might not be worth the exposure and additional stress. I understood. What he wasn't saying. Fighting Claire's lies would mean airing our family's dirty laundry for the world to see. It would mean explaining publicly how my own daughter had tried to steal my home and leave me homeless. After I hung up with Mr. Henderson, I sat in the quiet house feeling a rage unlike anything I'd experienced since Robert's death. Claire hadn't just tried to rob me, she'd tried to murder my reputation, my relationships, my very existence as her mother, but Robert had prepared for this too. In the blue folder, buried beneath the legal documents about the trust, I found a manila envelope marked social media evidence. Inside were printed screenshots of Claire's Facebook posts over the past 2 years, documenting her increasingly manipulative behavior. There were posts where she'd complained about having to visit her sick father and how it was interfering with her social life. Posts where she'd calculated the value of our house and made comments about how we were sitting on a goldmine while she struggled with student loans. Posts where she'd referred to me dismissively as Dad's wife rather than her mother, Robert. Had been documenting everything, building a case not just for the legal system but for the court of public opinion. If Claire wanted to play the social media game, he'd made sure I had the ammunition to win. That evening, I did something I'd never done before. I created my own Facebook account. I started with a simple post. My name is Joan Mitchell. I've been married to Robert Mitchell for 35 years and I'm the biological mother of Claire Mitchell. I've recently become aware that my daughter has been spreading false information about our family online, and I think it's time people knew the truth. I attached the screenshots Robert had collected, along with copies of Claire's birth certificate, showing me as her mother, our marriage certificate from 35 years ago, and a photo of the three of us from Claire's college graduation. Then I told the real story. How Claire had waited until her father died to try to steal our home. How she'd thrown me out with a $1,000 check and told me to find a cheap hotel. How she'd tried to sell property that didn't belong to her and was now facing legal consequences for fraud. I included Robert's medical records showing that he was mentally competent right up until his death, and testimonials from our neighbors and friends about his sharp mind and loving concern for my welfare. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Comments began pouring in within minutes, but these were very different from the ones on Claire's posts. People were horrified by what she'd done. They were angry on my behalf. They were sharing their own stories of family betrayal and financial abuse. Within hours, my post had been shared hundreds of times. Someone had found Claire's crowdfunding campaign and flooded it with comments linking to my post, asking why people were donating money to someone who had tried to make her own mother homeless. By the next morning, the crowdfunding campaign had been shut down and several of the comments on Claire's original posts had changed from sympathetic to skeptical to outright hostile. Claire called me at 8:30, her voice shaking with rage. How could you do this to me? You've destroyed everything. I told the truth, Claire. Something you seem to have forgotten how to do. You've ruined my reputation. People are calling me horrible names. People are calling you what you are. Someone who tried to steal from her own mother. I was just trying to protect you. By calling me your stepmother? By claiming I manipulated your father? By erasing 35 years of being your mother? The silence on the other end of the line was profound. Finally, Claire spoke in a voice I barely recognized. I never meant for it to go this far. Yes, you did. You meant every bit of it. You just didn't expect to get caught. What do you want from me, Mom? The word mom felt significant after days of being referred to as a stepmother online. I want you to take down every false post you've made. I want you to publicly apologize for lying about our relationship. And I want you to figure out how you're going to pay back the money you owe without involving me. And if I do all that? I looked around Robert's study, at the photos of our life together, at the evidence of how carefully he'd protected me even in death. Then maybe we can start over. Maybe we can figure out how to be mother and daughter again, instead of whatever this has become. But even as I said it, I wondered if it was too late for that. Some things, once broken, can never be fully repaired. 6 months later, I stood in my kitchen making coffee on a crisp October morning, watching the leaves change color around the lake. The house felt different now, not empty the way it had after Robert died, but peaceful. Like a place where healing could finally begin. Claire had done everything I'd asked. She'd taken down the false posts, issued a public apology, and found a second job to help pay her debts. But more importantly, she'd started therapy, something I'd suggested but never thought she'd actually do. The legal consequences of her actions had been severe but fair. She'd ended up owing nearly $300,000 in damages, legal fees, and penalties. Her condo had been sold to help cover the debt, and she'd moved into a small apartment across town. For the first time in her adult life, Claire was living within her means because she had no other choice. The doorbell rang, interrupting my thoughts. Through the window, I could see Claire's small used car in the driveway, the replacement for the luxury vehicle she'd bought with money that was never hers. "Hi, Mom." She looked different than she had 6 months ago. Thinner, more tired, but somehow more real. The designer clothes were gone, replaced by simple jeans and a sweater. The perfectly styled hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail. She looked like someone who worked for a living rather than someone who expected the world to be handed to her. "Come in, dear." These monthly visits had become our new routine. Not the close relationship we'd once had, but something honest for the first time in years. Claire would update me on her progress paying back her debts, and I would listen without offering to help. Some lessons, I'd learned, had to be earned the hard way. "I brought you something," she said, reaching into her purse and pulling out a small wrapped package. Inside was a framed photo, one I'd never seen before. It was from her college graduation, but not the formal family portrait I remembered. This was a candid shot someone had taken of Robert and me watching Claire receive her diploma. The love and pride on our faces was unmistakable. "I found it when I was going through some old boxes," Claire said quietly. "I thought you might want it." I traced the glass with my finger, remembering that day. How happy we'd all been, how full of hope for Claire's future. "Thank you. It's beautiful." We sat at the kitchen table, the same one where she'd thrown that $1,000 check at me and changed both our lives forever. But now it felt like neutral ground, a place where we could try to rebuild something from the wreckage. "Dr. Martinez thinks I'm making progress," Claire said, referring to her therapist. "She says I'm finally starting to understand how my behavior affected other people." "How do you feel about that?" Claire was quiet for a long time, staring at her hands. "Ashamed, mostly. I keep remembering things I did, things I said, and wondering how I became that person." I wanted to comfort her, the way I would have when she was a child with a scraped knee. But Claire wasn't a child anymore, and these weren't scrapes that could be healed with band-aids and kisses. "Your father always said that people show you who they are when they think no one important is watching." "I thought you weren't important," Claire said, so quietly I almost didn't hear her. "Not the way Dad was important, or my job was important, or my friends were important. I thought you were just there, like furniture." The honesty was brutal, but necessary. This was the kind of conversation we'd never been able to have before, when Claire was still performing the role of the dutiful daughter while secretly resenting every moment of it. "Why?" I asked. "Because you made it look so easy. Taking care of Dad, taking care of the house, taking care of everyone else. You never complained, never asked for anything, never seemed to need anything. I thought that meant you were weak." I considered this, remembering all the times I'd hidden my own needs to take care of my family's. All the times I'd pretended everything was fine when it wasn't, thinking I was being strong. "Maybe I was too good at hiding my feelings," I said finally. "Maybe if I'd been more honest about what I needed, you would have seen me as a real person, instead of just a caretaker." Claire looked up at me, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "I saw you, Mom. I just didn't want to. It was easier to think of you as someone who existed to make my life comfortable than to think of you as someone with your own dreams and feelings and needs." The admission hung between us like a bridge we weren't sure how to cross. This was further than we'd ever gotten in these monthly conversations, deeper than Claire had ever been willing to go. "I've been thinking about Dad a lot lately," she continued. "About how he must have felt, watching me treat you that way. How disappointed he must have been. He loved you, Claire. Even when he was protecting me from you, he still loved you. I know. That's what makes it worse. She wiped at her eyes. With the back of her hand. He saw who I was becoming and still hoped I could change. He set up that whole legal trap not just to protect you, but to force me to face consequences for once in my life. It was true. Robert's elaborate planning hadn't been revenge, it had been an intervention. A last desperate attempt to save his daughter from herself by making sure her actions finally had real consequences. Are you angry at him? I asked. Claire shook her head. I was, at first. But now I think he was the only one who loved me enough to try to stop me from destroying myself completely. We sat in comfortable silence for a while, both of us lost in memories of the man who had shaped both our lives in such different ways. I won't be able to pay off all the debt for another 3 years, Claire said eventually. Maybe 4. That's a long time. Dr. Martinez says that's probably good. That I need time to really understand what I did and why, not just rush through making amends so I can move on. I nodded, impressed despite myself by this new version of my daughter. The Claire who had thrown me out of my own home would never have had the patience for this kind of slow, difficult growth. I don't expect you to forgive me, she said suddenly. I know what I did was unforgivable. I looked at her across the table. This woman who had been my baby, my little girl, my greatest disappointment, and now, possibly, my hope for the future. I can't forgive what you did to me, Claire. At least not yet. But I can learn to love who you're becoming. It wasn't the reconciliation you see in movies, full of tears and dramatic declarations. It was quieter than that, more fragile. But it was real in a way our relationship had never been before. After Claire left, I walked to Robert's study and sat in his chair, looking at the photo she'd given me. In it, Robert's hand was resting on my shoulder as we watched our daughter graduate, both of us so proud of what we thought she would become. He'd been right about so many things. Right about Claire's true nature, right about the need to protect me, right about the importance of consequences. But he'd been right about something else too, that sometimes the people we love most are worth fighting for, even when they're fighting against us. I opened the desk drawer where I'd kept all his letters and legal documents, but today I pulled out something different. A bank statement for an account I'd never touched, one Robert had set up in the final months of his life, the Claire Educational Trust, he'd called it. $500,000 set aside specifically for Claire, but only accessible after she'd completed therapy and made full restitution for her actions. Only after she'd proven she'd really changed, another gift from a father who'd loved his daughter enough to save her from herself, even if it took years to do it. I folded the bank statement and put it back in the drawer. Claire would find out about it eventually, when she was ready. When she'd earned the right to be trusted with that kind of money again, but that day might never come, and I'd made my peace with that too. Outside my window, the lake reflected the late afternoon sun in 1,000 tiny diamonds. This house that had nearly been stolen from me was still mine, still filled with memories of the man who'd loved me enough to wage war with our own daughter to keep me safe. Some battles are worth fighting, even against the people we love most. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, everyone wins in the end.